So if you watched my last video where I did the Mica review and Corey came over and he just bought a Sony FX3 and then he was wanting to try out the Pocket Pro as well. So the reason he bought the Sony FX3 originally was to do like secondary content. If he needed a camera he could just pick up and go and shoot something really fast or something to go on a gimbal or behind the scenes footage. And after using this camera versus the FX3, he decided to actually send back his FX3 and buy the Pocket 6K Pro.
Every camera is a tool, and every tool is meant to be used in a certain way. Every camera wants to be used differently and is generally designed to be used to accomplish a specific task. When I first saw the FX3 on paper, it literally checked every single box that I wanted except internal NDs. The form factor was amazing. I'd seen some incredible Sony test footage online, and the ability to throw a mic on there without really rigging it out, the autofocus, the IBIS, it seemed like a dream run and gun camera come true. Keep in mind that I come from the ARRI cinema world, and I'm used to using cameras that are pretty massive and usually require a crew to operate effectively. And while ARRIs produce arguably one of the very best images in the world, they take a lot of time to build out and rig up for specific jobs. So even while owning an Alexa Classic and the coveted Alexa Mini, I found that, to my surprise, sometimes neither of those cameras are actually the right tool for the job. I wanted a camera that I could pick up and just shoot with. I could throw it in a bag, I could take it on location scouts, something small, something powerful. And the thought behind most of that is that if I have the time and resources to go and rig something out, I'm just gonna shoot it on the Alexa Mini because there's no point in building out a lower end camera to try and make it function like an Alexa was already designed to function. I want something that stays out of my way as a filmmaker. I don't wanna have to think about the camera when I'm using it, and I want a camera that becomes sort of a physical extension of the creative process. I don't want to have to fight with my camera to create something. And as a filmmaker, I like that design philosophy a lot. Sort of give me the essential exposure and color building blocks, and then let me take it from there. So you've got white balance, ISO, ND, and aperture. And if a few of those settings are not immediately accessible after picking up a camera, I'm just totally out. Like, I'm not trying to fuss with the menus to change basic settings like ISO. There's a million other things to think about while filmmaking other than your settings. And ultimately, as a competent cinematographer, what happens within your frame lines is infinitely more important than the brand of camera that you're using to create it. On the FX3, everything is customizable, and sometimes I just don't want that. Like, the very best design is often the simplest design. The FX3 started to fall apart as a dream camera for me from literally the second that I turned it on. And maybe I just didn't give it enough time, but I have a feeling that that's not really the case. I have loads of cameras from loads of different manufacturers from the last like 70 years, and I can pick up any single one of them and understand how to use it in just a few seconds. So I adore the form factor of the FX3. It feels fantastic, but just like, why are these menus so convoluted? I don't understand. For example, don't make my ISO button dial lock when I hit a random button on the back of the camera, and then somehow only allow it to unlock after making me spend like 20 minutes in a menu setting trying to figure out why it even locked in the first place. Originally, I stayed away from the Blackmagic cameras because I just thought that the bodies were ugly. Like, I could not get over the form factor, which I know is silly, and I wish I would have just held one in my hands a few years ago. But as far as ergonomics go, I mean, dang, the Pocket 6K Pro feels so good. It's heavy, don't get me wrong, but then again, I'm used to Alexas, so I don't really mind the heft. In fact, I think the size helps stabilize the footage even more, which is actually an added benefit of some of the bigger cinema cameras. I was pleasantly surprised to find that the Pocket 6K Pro had a seemingly similar design philosophy as the ARRI when it comes to actually operating the camera. Every button and setting is pretty much exactly where you'd want it to be when it's in your hands. It's extremely intuitive in that regard. The menu layout, the user interface is gorgeous. The thing just works. The little flippy screen is amazing for low-angle shooting. The previous generations didn't have the flip-out screen, and that's one of the reasons that I stayed away from them. But within 5 minutes of shooting with the 6K Pro, I felt like I knew everything I needed to know about the camera and how to get around it. and anything that I would learn after that would just be icing on the cake. It was one of those things that just sort of immediately felt familiar, and the more I used it, the more I liked it. It's kind of like when you try on a new pair of pants, but it feels like you've already been wearing those pants for like years and years. You know what I mean? I recently switched over to DaVinci from Premiere, and like, what? We're talking 6K raw footage playing back as if it was 1080 ProRes files in Premiere. It's absolute butter. Like, it's unbelievable how efficient that B-Raw codec is. But what about the FX3 screen? Honestly, aside from the histogram, that's one of the most unusable screens of any camera that I've ever used. The build quality of it's really great and it feels really solid, but as far as the screen goes, even with the gamma assist on, there's basically no way of knowing what's really going on with exposure without really rigging up an external monitor. And the Sony doesn't have internal NDs either, which for a 2021 cinema camera release, like, why? Then you gotta add a matte box or a variable ND to the front, and it's just one more thing to carry around with you. But the internal NDs on the Pocket 6K Pro are fantastic. You've got 2 stops, 4 stops, and 6 stops, and they look amazing, and they work exactly like they're supposed to, nice and fast. I love the placement of the buttons right by your thumb whenever you're holding the camera. There's not a whole lot else to talk about here, they just work. The microphone option on the FX3 was one of the biggest selling points for me before using it. And I used to be an audio engineer and musician, and I probably obsess over sound more than the average video guy. But the design of the handle in conjunction with any kind of nice microphone ends up turning the entire camera body into a giant microphonic source, meaning the handling noise of the camera becomes unbearable. Now there's ways around that, like using a Sonella mount or some other shock mount added via quarter 20 on the top or the handle. But now you've got an external monitor for color, you've got an external mount on top of an already existing microphone mount, you've got a matte box or some kind of ND on the front, and it just gets really big and out of hand really quickly. And in my opinion, if you're gonna be doing that and spending that kind of money, just go and get a higher end cinema camera. Also, one other factor that I didn't really consider with the FX3 was the autofocus noise. Maybe it's just a problem with the Sigma lenses and the Sigma to Sony adapter, and I hear it is, but I can't say for sure because I don't own any G series or G Master lenses. But the autofocus noise is so loud on the Sigmas that you can't even use the autofocus and the audio at the same time, or it just ruins your audio. So your options with the FX3 are basically good audio and manual focus or bad audio and autofocus. And that was a huge letdown from a documentary perspective because I thought this would be sort of the ideal small camera with perfect audio, and it turns out that that's not the case. Here's some test footage from the FX3 with the Sigmas on autofocus.
Let's get in tighter on this, but just take care of what you're doing. Okay. So we're doing it on camera for me right here.
No problem. Does it matter which direction you want me to go?
Let's have you go, guys. We want them to go which way the camera?
To the right of that couch?
Probably through the middle. Okay, through the middle. Right? Through the middle. Camera speeds? Yeah, that's good. Camera speeds. And action.
Which brings us to the 6K Pro's internal mics, and for the first time ever, they're actually usable. Like, in a sense that if you were to go out and grab some ambient stuff that wasn't super hot in the mix, you could totally get away with it. It's pretty brittle sounding for any kind of critical dialogue though. You definitely wouldn't want to try and use it in that sort of scenario. You need a real external mic for dialogue. But for ambient stuff, that internal mic is pretty freaking decent. The thing that really solidified the Pocket 6K Pro in my mind as the perfect B cam was the files that it spits out. I messed endlessly with the Sony footage and still wasn't super happy with where it would land. It's always seemed to be like smudgy and green and blown out, and I just really did not like the codec at all. You don't even have to touch Alexa footage. It just freaking works like right out of the camera, and it's incredibly beautiful. And it felt very familiar as far as workflow goes with the Pocket 6K Pro in post. It just works, and the raw codec made it that much easier in post to push the footage around. In fact, I was able to push the Blackmagic raw footage just as far as the Alexa footage, if not even further in some cases, and it was an absolute pleasure to work with. There's so much information in B-Raw, it's insane. So wrapping up, Sony's going back to New York, and the Pocket 6K Pro is going to stay with me. Now, the Pocket 6K Pro, is it going to replace an Alexa on big productions? Probably not, at least for now. There's certain needs on larger productions that just require an Alexa. You know, it's built to be that specific tool. Also, you know, you've got the film industry politics that definitely come into play here. You've got big budgets, you've got big producers, you've got big investors, you've got big actors, and they all want big cameras and the best tools for the job. And they're probably not going to skimp on a camera package in any way if they don't have to. So they want the best, and ARRI's still the best. Even guys that have, you know, ARRIs, like I've got a buddy named Charlie who's got an Amira, and he just bought a Pocket 6K Pro yesterday. They're just incredible cameras. On a side note, we're about to have a little girl, so I hear diapers are pretty expensive, and I gotta pay for that. So hit that subscribe button, try and get us to 1K subscribers so that I can monetize this channel and pay for diapers. Thanks, bye.